This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
More than any other sports story in recent years, the NBA lockout of this summer forced America to confront the issues of race in sports in ways that we hadn't seen before. Today we're joined by two thinkers of sports, Bomani Jones, contributor to ESPN.com, and David Leonard, professor at Washington State University, talk about race in sports in the National Basketball Association. And later we're joined by Professor James Braxton Peterson, Director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University, as we talk about the Occupy the Academy movement. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left to Black. Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined in studio by Mr. Bomani Jones, journalist, sports commentator, former host of The Morning Jones on The Score, Sirius Channel 158, and well-known contributor to ESPN's Around the Horn, as well as Jim Rohn is Burning. And via Skype, we are joined by Professor David Leonard, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Critical Culture, Gender and Race Studies at Washington State Pullman, the author of the forthcoming After Our Tests, Race and the Assault on Blackness, which will be published by State University of New York Press in May of 2012. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you doing today?
All right. All right, thanks for having us.
So it's the beginning of January, the day that we're taping this. The NBA has been up and running now for about 10 days. After what was a contentious labor dispute, one that bled, I think, into mainstream culture in ways that we hadn't seen before. When we think about the last labor situation in the NBA back in '99, the internet was there, but it did not nearly have the kind of impact. I mean, it was mainly driven by sports talk radio. Now with all the major players having Twitter feeds, all of us on Twitter and Facebook, it seems as though the American public had access to the NBA labor dispute in ways that they hadn't had access before. And in fact, the players had a mechanism to control the narrative in ways that they very rarely have had that kind of control. Talk a little bit about what you saw, Bomani, in terms of this dispute, you know, as it played out over the end of the summer and into the fall.
Well, the interesting part about this is we had all these means for communication and all these avenues to discuss it, and people were still as stupid about this as they possibly could have been from the very beginning. I mean, I think we learned a lot about the intractability of people's views on a lot of subjects. Because look, this is very simple. It was a money grab. Like whether you think that the money grab by the owners was justifiable or not, you know, regardless of what you think of the strategy, it was obviously a money grab. It was on the basis of this idea that the NBA teams are not making money, but then you look up and they sure do sell. Nobody's talking about selling except the ones that are, and they're finding people to buy their teams, right? So, I mean, we had that level of confusion that it got to, but what we really saw come out, and I always say the thing about social media is that it exposes people who are on it, because you can only be but so professional, or however you want to call it, for so long. Eventually, what you really think is going to happen to come out. And fundamentally, we got to the point with this lockout where you just heard basically these guys don't deserve that much money. They need to stop complaining. They need to be happy with what they've got. And the ability to kind of see those messages in lots of different people's native intellectual and communicative habitats, so to speak, that was the most interesting part to me, because I could not believe how many times and how many people I saw that just basically, that are otherwise intelligent people who just made the argument that these guys should be happy with the money that they're making, and just under the assumption that the owners are entitled to profits and that the players should just be thrilled to be there.
David, you wrote basically a book's length of pieces this past fall covering the NBA labor strife, also in terms of the NFL. And one of the things I think that comes through in all of your work and all your writings on this is talking about really connecting this and the very kind of public reaction that Bomani is talking about to this broader conversation around race and particularly black masculinity. It wasn't just that the ball players weren't deserving of the money that they were getting, but you know, there was something else, right? These black men, right, who were the dominant faces of the league, really weren't deserving of the kind of money they were demanding. And it wasn't just the money, right? Because part of what was being articulated is that there had been a shift in terms of thinking about NBA players as being the brand in ways that we hadn't seen this brand before. not just the labor, but really the brand, and the brand really trying to dictate what this was going to be. And there was a lot of pushback, obviously, from the owners and David Stern, but also from, you know, the viewing public, right, that just selfishly wanted to be able to see their ball players run up and down the court.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting that we can look at the NBA lockout, you know, from a few months back and talk about that assault on blackness. And while the NBA is, you know, up and running, we see it in other realms. I mean, you have Rick Santorum talking about entitlement programs, and then what seems like a Freudian slip says, oh, I'm really only talking about black people on welfare, because in his mind, that appears to be the only people who's on.
Right.
Well, and so,
or legitimately, right, or illegitimately so, right.
And so it's this notion of who deserves, who's entitled, who functions and earns in a merit-based society. And whether you look at Mitt Romney or Ron Paul or Rick Santorum, that seems to be a kind of a fundamental element of our racial discourse. And you saw that with the NBA lockout. It reminded me of this quote from a Major League Baseball scout who, in talking about their efforts to recruit in Latin America and the Caribbean, said, well, it doesn't matter that we're paying them so low. Without us, they'd be selling mangoes. Yeah. And that seemed to be the fundamental argument that we saw in so many different places, that whether the players are getting 57% or 50%, whatever they're getting is more than they would get in other industries. And all the racist assumptions about work and intellect all seem to play out in that context, and led, you know, the mass number of people that we see in social media to kind of support owners in ways that we didn't even see with the NFL. Yeah.
You're watching Up to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined in studio by Bomani Jones, journalist, longtime contributor to ESPN.com, as well as ESPN's Around the Horn. We're joined via Skype by Professor David Leonard from Washington State Pullman, the author of the forthcoming book, After Our Test. Let me ask another question in this regard, because, you know, as we think about, you know, as Tabidi Lewis would describe this as a generation of ballers, and not just in terms of what they do on the court, but a generation of folks, you know, whether we're talking about hip hop or athletes, who've been very committed to controlling their brand and taking control of their product, if you will. Why not, if you're the players looking at this, and really as it becomes very contentious, you know, around October, why not think about going the route of say, the Negro Leagues, right? Why not decide to take control and take the 50 best players in the league and just shop your skills to any folks who wanted to come and watch, you know, instead of taking your services, threatening to take your service to Europe or waiting out to strike? You know, why not do it yourself, you know, at this stage?
Well, the biggest problem right now is that television is such a driving force in everything that happens in sports. It's the biggest thing in college sports that makes reform almost impossible. Like, if you take college athletics off of television, you clean up 90% of the problems that you have with the games. I'm dead serious. That's all you have to do. That's where the money comes in. The money that is being used to pay these guys the money they make now is money that comes from television. And that would be the interesting game to see what would happen, is that if you took these guys, would they be able to command a television contract? Yeah. Because if they could command a television contract, that is the moment where everything would change. Changes.
I mean, because part of what you're suggesting is that there may have been even some level of collusion on the part of the owners and the networks.
Yeah, I mean,
in terms of driving this conversation.
I put it like this: if I were in charge of a sports league and I hear these 50 guys are talking about getting their product on television, I make a couple of phone calls. You call me right, you call me wrong. That's what I do. But I think you pointed towards something that's very important, and it wouldn't shock me if at some point in the not too distant future, and I would say 20-something years is not too distant, if something like that happened, because this generation is more aware of its own personal brand power than any generation has ever been. These are guys that it's not just that people have been making money off of them forever, is they have seen their impact as basketball players and as commodities. Like, they've gotten to witness it since they were 13, 14 years old because of the way the AAU circuit goes. one guy in basketball makes so much of a difference. That's why the agents are there like vultures at these tournaments looking for young guys and trying to start these relationships early. That's why people were willing to guess on high schoolers for so long, because one guy can be that important. And these guys have been the one guy for the longest time, and they've seen everybody get rich, and they know that these guys have been fighting over them because they are that important. And I think part of the lockout that infuriated a lot of people was the idea that these guys were entitled and believed that they were that important. The problem is that they are.
Right. I mean, you made the point about last time we were on the show about LeBron, right? And for all the criticism that LeBron made about the announcement, you look at the share that he got, the number of people who watched it, you know, you recognize his power. The trade that Carmelo was able to force to the Knicks, literally dictating where he wanted to go, you know, speaks to that kind of power.
And they had no choice, but it's really, it comes down to the fundamentals of basketball. Like, the issue with Carmelo is you lose a guy like Carmelo, you're not going to get equal value. A guy like that is so rare. You're not going to get a replacement for him. So you got to do the best you can, because you can stare a guy and, you know, stare a guy down. Cleveland didn't stare LeBron down, but they said, look, we're going to try for one more championship. You know, we're going to try to win this championship this year, and then if it doesn't work, whatever. But they had the option of trading LeBron James in that season and cutting their losses. No, he was too important because of how close they were, so they kept him. A guy like Carmelo, you can't just let him walk. So you have to do something. But then he says, well, yeah, well, if I go there, I'm not going to sign an extension. Well, the other team says, no, well, I'm not going to trade for him. And now he says, okay, well, I'm only going to sign an extension here. And now they have to do it. And the reason is he, as a basketball player, beyond any interpretation, is that functionally important. And you can win the game if you can somehow win the capitalism of it.
Yeah. David, part of After Our Test really talks about what has been this kind of ongoing backlash to the, you know, the emergence of these athletes as having a significant kind of cultural power. They've always had that cultural power, but now they're trying to translate that into very real economic power. What do you see as kind of the backlash that's going to develop in the aftermath of the labor dispute as they go forward?
Well, I think it would just be a continuation of what we've seen, you know, beginning in, well, not beginning, but kind of amplified after the Palace Brawl, of a growing pushback against the NBA and the kind of marketing of individuals. And that's not to say, as Bomani rightly points out, the NBA is built on and has long profited off of marketing individuals, not only in the United States, but globally. But I think more so in the United States, there'll be this effort to sell the league, to sell the product of the NBA through teams, through rivalries. There is an increasing reluctance to kind of put all of the NBA's eggs in the post-Jordan basket. They have long waited for the next Jordan, and whether that Jordan left Cleveland, or that Jordan ran into some problems in Colorado, or that Jordan was not as good as they thought they were going to be, i.e. Harold Miner, Vince Carter, Grant Hill getting hurt, et cetera, et cetera.
Or if you're Tim Duncan, just not as interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
And so I think there's a holdout with Kevin Durant, and I think that's also where the lockout really is about. It's about restricting player movement and incentivizing players to stay. And so the whole Derrick Rose rule, although if the NBA really wanted to stop player movement, what they would do is allow players, those elite players, to make, you know, to not cap their value. Everyone talks about players being overpaid, but some of the appeal that New York had to Carmelo or Miami has to LeBron is that they can make more money off the court in those places. And so if you could make it so players could make more money, you know, off the court and all that comes, and not just the superstars, but those next level stars, that might change player movement. But player movement's a reality, and I think the Carmelo trade kind of illustrates this whole idea of protecting Denver by protecting player movement. Well, I don't know. I might rather be a Nuggets fan than a Knicks fan right now.
How have you both enjoyed the game so far?
Oh, they couldn't kill it. The fascinating thing about the lockout is, if you want proof that the players really had a point, was in spite of everything and the Chris Paul trade disaster, the players were too good for them to kill the league.
Right.
Like, it's back, everybody's watching it, there's more interest
I mean,
now
because
than
here's
ever.
the thing, it reminds me to make a comparison to the music industry, and this is something that my buddy Ninth Wonder talks about a lot. You know, music is at the point now, and you think about American Idol as a model for this, where you can be in your shower and sing a song, and you can really believe that you are as good as Beyonce, or you're as good as Lady Gaga, right? And they've created a mechanism, right, in which you can do that. I mean, that's what American Idol is. And ultimately what that process does is that it actually erodes the power of individual stars. Because it's, you know, because they've lowered the bar so much right. in terms of what it is, that you can always find someone else, right? So that means individual artists tend to be much more cautious in terms of what they demand. Professional sports is not that way, right? No matter what you think about a player, the average fan knows that they can't go on the field and do, I mean, because you're really talking about elite performers, right?
Think about this. David Stern made a move that made people legitimately compare the way the league was run to wrestling. And we don't care. The games are back, and they're just that good because the players are just that individually talented. I mean, that's the part. You see things like I saw, I think this is in a preseason game, one of the Lakers-Clippers game, where Chauncey Billups throws about a three-quarter court, one-handed bounce pass off the dribble to somebody streaking in for a basket. That's an everyday thing that happens in the NBA. This just happens all the time. That guys just do stuff like that.
I mean, and that's the irony, right? Because here in a society that champions itself on being a meritocracy, somehow that meritocracy gets thrown out the window when we're talking about black athletes.
Oh, yeah, no, the NBA, is one of my readers told me, he said that this lockout was about minimizing the competitive advantage of competence.
Yeah. Wow.
And it's succinct and perfect.
And not just of players, but of management.
Yeah.
It's like, we want to hedge our bets. And, you know, if you're a GM who doesn't, you know, get the job done, it's not our fault. It's the system's fault.
Right. Any predictions about where the season goes in terms of looking at the skill set of some of the teams?
The Miami Heat are going to beat everybody into the ground. I mean, I thought that this year, if it was a full season, was going to be that year. That's the biggest one. Like, that's the show now, is to watch the Heat run through the league.
I'm a New York Knicks fan.
Yeah, we hope that works out for you, man. I hope that works out. You guys have had a tough time. You've had a tough time. And, you know, it's funny, as David mentioned about the Nuggets. The Nuggets are better off without Carmelo. Quiet as it's kept.
Yeah.
You might want to be careful about
and how about you and your Lakers, David?
Well, I think Bomani is right in terms of the Heat. And I think if it was a full season with a full training camp, they would have been as good. But I think they benefit from the lockout and the ridiculous 47 games in 24-hour schedule, because they got the best players. They know what they're doing. They have a system in place. They got individual talent. So I think they are going to be very dominant. And I think as I looked at was looking online today, I can't predict the rest of the season because at the pace we're going, everyone will be injured.
Yeah.
By tomorrow, thanks to the non-training camp, let's play every hour.
But even talk about that in some of this broader context, right? The idea that literally like the players are like chattel. You know, or cattle in this regard, right?
But you know what though? Everybody gets paid by the game.
Yeah.
This is one thing, I guarantee you this. You give the player the option of 66 checks versus 54 checks. We will have the 66 check uprising. And there will be, I know I would. Hey, everybody's done that time and a half work before. This is that time and a half.
And let's talk about this for a second, right? Because, you know, we can go back to Bill Rhoden's language about $40 million slaves, right? And of course, Brian Gumbel throws out that language about plantations. And all these conversations that compare, you know, professional athletes to chattel, right? Or thinking about professional athletes as being slavery. I mean, a lot of folks resist that. Even the most progressive folks politically really resist the use of that language. But when we look at the relationship of labor and capital, right, there's some dynamics of professional sports where that relationship fundamentally has not changed, right? You have a group of laborers who are exploited for their labor, and yes, they may get different benefits. but for the benefit of somebody else who remains largely invisible, right? It's interesting that we're more willing to think about LeBron James as being part of the 1%.
Yeah.
And not think about, you know, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers or the Miami Heat as part of that 1%, right? And actually the more powerful member of that 1%.
Yeah, now that was one of the things that struck me in the course of the lockout was that part. Say, really, how do you juxtapose this? Because it's, you know, they say nobody wants to hear millionaires versus billionaires argue, but reality was nobody wanted to hear the millionaires argue.
Right.
The billionaires arguing, like, how do you get $1 billion without arguing, I suppose, is the argument. That you cannot get past that point, that's
right.
what it is. Like I said, we learned a lot about the way people view a lot of this, and we found out, not that we didn't know it before, a lot of jealous people out here.
Yeah, yeah. David?
Yeah, I think just the unwillingness to see sport outside of this kind of raceless meritocracy fantasy. And so the insertion of the slavery metaphor or plantation or talking about exploitation or even talking about, you know, I wrote about the injuries and the schedule. And yes, it is driven by obviously the finances, not only of the league and the owners, but the players. But the resistance to even introducing that idea was, oh, they're professional athletes. They can run up and down for 2 hours. They're paid millions of dollars. You know, you don't see me complaining that I have to go to my job without a vacation. There is a comparison. I mean, name another profession where, you know, you abuse your body and lose 5 pounds in a 2-hour span. And
yeah,
I think
right.
I think that the interesting difference between the NBA and the NFL is because of all the media coverage about concussions and the reports about you know, various players in retirement and the awful physical conditions and even death of players in terms of head trauma, led to a kind of shift where people began to see NFL players, and I think race plays a part of it as well.
I mean, there's a white ethnic presence in professional football that we don't see.
That,
you know, any NBA players named Roethlisberger.
Well, and then add to that the kind of presumed violence and harm of the game. Well, they deserve their money,
right?
As opposed to the idea that NBA players deserve that there's hard work, that there's dedication, that there's sacrifice, that there's abuse on body, and that people are making billions of dollars off of them, not just the owners, but
the networks,
you know,
right.
Networks and you know, companies like Nike. I mean, back to one of the things that you and Bomani were talking about at the beginning. What prevents the players from, you know, creating their own institution is not just collusion, but they're all kind of this connected in some way. You got ABC and ESPN and Disney, and, you know, they're all really, you know, in many ways the same company now.
Yeah.
And that limits the power of the players to where they're going to go. What apparel company are they going to get?
Yeah.
What network are they going to get? And so nobody wants to talk about those things.
We're on Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon via Skype by Professor David Leonard and in studio by Mr. Bomani Jones. What's next for you, Bomani?
Hey, man, you know, just paying these bills, working with SBNation.com is my new main gig. So we're writing there and got some more multimedia projects on the works. I've got a weekly chat show, The Evening Jones, at theeveningjones.com. We do that Mondays at 8, 7 Central. So we get on and talk and get on video chat, something very similar to this format. We get on once a week. So just, you know, trying to keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, you don't realize how important it is, Bomani, that there's some little black kid, someone sitting somewhere that turns on around the horn that's like, wow, I can grow up and be a sports journalist, right?
And still have fun. I think that's kind of the fun part, because the way I figure it is, look, if they're gonna kick me off, they're gonna kick me off, but I'm not gonna strike out looking. You know, like that's it. I'm not going to strike out looking. So, you know, that's kind of the fun part when people talk about, like, I can't imagine your parents force you to watch around the horn if you're 11 years old. But if they do, I hope I can make it a little bit better.
Absolutely. And David, after our test drops in May, want to talk a little bit about the new book?
It drops in May. It looks at the kind of transformation of the NBA since the Palace Brawl, arguing that the Palace Brawl kind of pointed to the illusion or the untenable illusion of the post-racial Michael Jordan fantasy. And so look at the dress code, look at the age debate, look at the brawl itself, and connect those arguments and the media culture, particularly the new media culture, to see what we can learn not only about race in the NBA, but race in society at large.
I'm so jealous because I have wanted to write that book for years. I'm dead serious. Like when I heard you say after our test, I was like, oh, you wrote my book.
I mean, when Mark's first question about new media, I mean, I think it was striking to me because as I was looking, and I have notebooks like with thousands of pages of articles, where it was like, when I put them against each other, it was like, wow, look at what's being said. And, 10 years ago, it was said in one spot and then in another, but the opportunity to look at it and see like, well, how many people are going to call him, Artest, and others thugs and gangsters, and how many are going to blame the NBA image problem on high school players, even though the All-Star game is former high school players? Right. How many are going to go off on those cautionary tales of players who didn't make it without any self-reflexivity about, well, what does that mean? How many, all the ones that did make it? How about all the players who spent 4 years on college, Michael Olakandi, and
and don't make it, right?
Well, he was lucky to stay in the league as long as he did.
I mean, how many 14-year-old tennis players are we talking about?
Yes.
Right?
Or 14-year-olds that think they're going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah. Or the fun one is 18-year-old baseball players in the minor leagues where nobody has a college degree in baseball.
Right.
Like
Absolutely.
Nobody. They're a poorly educated lot. Hockey, and you try them all around the world, into far-lone locations to go play hockey.
And they don't get, I mean, even the NBA players that went straight from high school and signed one deal and out, they're far better financially than those 18-year-olds in Major League Baseball, and worse, those coming from Latin America who are paid nothing and then say, well, we don't want you, and then they'll be in Arizona and, woo, we know what Arizona does.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor David Leonard and sports journalist and commentator Bomani Jones. You've been watching Left to Black. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
I'll tell you exactly what I'm gonna do. Get in the groove and let the good time roll. I'm gonna stay here till I soothe my soul. If it take all night long, everybody let the good time roll. We gonna stay here till we soothe our souls.
You're back on Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined this afternoon by Professor James Braxton Peterson, who is the Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of English at Lehigh University, just fresh off 2 stints on MSNBC, on Bashir Live yesterday, and also the Ed Show last night. How you doing today,
I'm good,
James?
I'm good, man. I'm good.
It's so great to see you busy, and of course there's been a lot of discussion recently about, black scholars who actually do work in the televisional vein, looking particularly at the recent hiring of Melissa Harris Perry for her weekend show. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about what the balance is like? And it's an extraordinary balance for you because you're not just teaching as a professor and doing your research, you're also directing an Africana Studies program.
I'm trying to build a program.
And at the same time, you know, responding to this need to have your voice out there in the wider public sphere. What's it like trying to balance these pressures?
It's insanity. But first, let me say congratulations to Melissa. I think Melissa has worked hard to earn that spot. I'm excited to see her show. I think what MSNBC has done, even just over the course of the year with Al Sharpton's show and Melissa Harris Perry's show, is actually revolutionary in the cable news network. And I'm actually just excited to even be low man on the totem pole of that kind of movement in the media. I mean, I think, and brother man, you know this because you've groomed me for public work, and Michael Eric Dyson has groomed me for the work. We work very, very hard outside of things that count in terms of the academy,
right,
in order to make forays into the media world and into the media sphere and the public sphere. And so what people don't know maybe about some of this stuff is, you know, I've spent thousands of hours practicing, preparing, reading, and doing things that actually don't count in terms of the tenure track, in terms of my directorship. This is like extra work. I've spent thousands of hours preparing to do some of the stuff that I do in the public sphere. So it's exciting when you get 2 hits in one day, and that's what I had yesterday. But it's more exciting to me to see the movement, to see the hiring of Michael Eric Dyson this year, to see Reverend Al Sharpton get his own show, to see the hiring of Michael Steele, and the hiring of, obviously, of Melissa Harris Perry, and then her getting her own show. A lot of movement on MSNBC. Love to see some of these other networks take that as a challenge and step up, because, believe it or not, black folk are still underrepresented
in the mainstream media. Absolutely.
In the mainstream media.
I mean, it's fascinating on so many different levels, because you wonder, you know, we could transpose this kind of historical moment now to the past. What someone like Du Bois would have been able to do if he would have had the kind of forum that you know, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or MSNBC, would have afforded him, right? And we know that was something that he was interested in, which is why he's writing all these novels, right? I mean, because it wasn't just always a scholarship. He was always trying to find different ways. You know, for him, the Crisis magazine was his generation's Twitter, right? It was a way that he could put his voice out there in the world.
That's right. Well, first of all, Du Bois searches for platforms, so he tries the essay, novels, the essay collection, the sociology study, Crisis magazine. He wasn't that great of a speaker, but he still tried his hand at the public speaking piece. The bottom line is he searched for different platforms because he understood the value of reaching as many people as possible with the information that he was distilling through his scholarship. Now, I'm not Du Bois, okay? So I'm not trying to claim that legacy, but I have to admit to you that it is more satisfying and gratifying for me to be able to reach the people that I reach through MSNBC, as opposed to the number of people who maybe have read Dead Presidents. And, you know, I love Callaloo, and I love that essay, Dead Presidents. I think it's one of the best things I've ever written. But the bottom line is, if I write for your blog, if I write for Racialists, if I post for Huffington Post, more people are reading that stuff. So for me personally, and because I'm committed to having a voice in the community, and I'm committed to thinking about and talking about things in the public sphere, I do want to have more access. And although I try to be as humble as possible about that, I'm deeply invested in communicating with people about the things that we think about and intellectualize about in the academy.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Anthony Neal, your host, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor James Braxton Peterson, Director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University. A few weeks ago, James, you did a piece at the HuffPost Black Voices called Occupy the Academy. And it was a great piece because it talked about, you know, wherever the Occupy movement is at this particular moment, one of the things that Occupy has done, and shout out to our colleague Sami Alim, you know, who really puts this out in a broader context, it has fundamentally changed the way that we think about language, right?
Yes.
A term like occupy now has become even more of a verb in terms of a kind of political commentary about what it means to take over spaces and radically transform those spaces.
Yes.
So you did this piece on Occupy the Academy. Talk a little bit about, you know, what that means for you to be able to look at the academy, university culture, as a space, as a transformative space to really do important and radical work.
Yes. Well, so the piece is inspired by many, many things, and I'll just try to list a few of them here. Number one, you know, you'll notice when I tweet, sometimes I always put Sally Gelati in there, and Sally is like the communications person at Lehigh. And so when I think about like all the different PR nightmares of the year, you know, with the Sandusky case and the UC Davis students and the Yale stuff. I think about her, someone who has to be concerned about the university's public relations on a regular basis and how tough that is. Then I started to think about a lot of the folk in our sort of clique of scholars who have established themselves outside of the academy, but for whatever reasons over the last couple of years have decided to come into the academy to get degrees in the humanities. And these are documentary filmmakers, politicians, journalists, and really big name folk doing that. And to me, and this is not to disrespect any of us who are already in the humanities, it's really just inspiring to me to see those folk come into the humanities at this time.
And you know, the thing that's really interesting about that, and you mentioned the particular people, Scott Polson Bryan, who of course is, you know, ABD, you know, up at Harvard and American Civilization, Joan Morgan, who's at NYU. I mean, there's so many other great examples. And of course, folks looking from the outside of these folks going, oh, well, you know, these are just folks who are coming in and translating their hip hop street cred into the academy.
They have no idea.
The irony is that none of them are in the academy working on hip hop.
Sure, right. That's right.
I mean, actually, which talks about the way that they had broader intellectual interests that didn't get recognized. In fact, it was limiting for them in the world of journalism as hip hop journalists, and the academy gives them a way to kind of spread their wings intellectually and think about many broader issues in this regard.
Yes, but also all of them all bring a different kind of political energy to the graduate school process. And I include my wife in this as well, because she started off as a registered nurse, and just the energy that she brings in and a kind of like no nonsense kind of presentation about politics and being progressive and being fair and equality. I just love that energy. And we're talking about 4 or 5 folk here, but there's about a dozen folk that I have in mind.
Right. I mean, Rosa Clemente, right? I mean, if you ever had any you know, we know this, but if folks have ever had contact with Rosa Clemente and how fiery it is, to imagine that in a classroom, right? And, you know, just, you know, takes it to a whole nother level.
Or on a panel, or in the journals. I just feel like that kind of, first of all, that's not a movement that I'm starting. I'm not trying to say I'm trying to lead the Occupy the Academy movement. I'm saying that's a movement that's going on. And it's a counter, and we need to cover that because that's the counter to all that bad PR. And yes, Aleem's piece, Occupy language, really set me off because he's so brilliant. And
Aleem occupied the New York Times for that piece. I mean, that's why that's critical, right? This is a New York Times piece, right?
Yes, he's performing what he's talking about. And the one thing people don't know is that Aleem is a former student of mine. Right. And so it's
a former fellow here at Duke.
Yes, exactly, right? So this is a great network of folk, but just the energy around that also inspired. But I got to tell you also, brother, man, I had no idea that it would touch the chord that it touched. Yeah. Like, I mean, the way people circulated and the way people were talking about how they felt about it, like, it really moved me, the response that I got from that. Again, I write journal articles and I do academic writing, but the response that I got from Occupy the Academy is what inspires me to keep doing the kind of work.
Right. You're watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by Professor James Braxton Peterson, who is a professor of English at Lehigh University, where he's also the director of Africana Studies. A few months back, James, we had the opportunity to collaborate with our colleague David Leonard, writing a piece about the attack on liberal education as it played out in these very interesting critiques of Mike Eric Dyson's class on Jay-Z. And it's interesting because, you know, if we think about what that class might even look like this semester, we'd have to bring fatherhood into the conversation, right? In a real significant kind of way.
That's right.
Were you surprised at all hearing Jay-Z talk so lovingly and honestly, right, as he has, you know, Beyonce's, he and Beyonce's daughter was born 2 days ago. Yesterday, he
drops a song,
drops a single, right, Glory, about his daughter. Are you surprised by his ability to really talk about how this particular life moment, you know, really touched him in a significant kind of way, and his willingness to share that, you know, with the public?
I'm more surprised by his willingness to share and that open access than I am by his ability to get to that space emotionally. I mean, if we listen to his music and it's there. That, you know, the potential for him to be raw and emotional, to be sincere, to be open, the potential for him to be sort of up against an intention with the hypermasculinity of hip hop culture, that's already all been there. He's just been more private and more closed. So I'm curious about the quickness and the pace at which he he got it out there and he exposed himself that way. But honestly, I think that's more of a representation of his excitement about the birth of his child than anything else. And so, yes, and here's the thing about the piece that we did. First of all, folks should know collaboration is really hard. And so it's really amazing that the three of us were able to piece that together. But I think we all felt it was important. And it's not like we have we're not being vindicated because Jay-Z has just had a child and he seems more open and more fatherly this week. The vindication for us was in the writing of the piece, where we could attack all the different or address all the different folk who tried to critique an enterprise that we think is really, really important, which is hip-hop scholarship. Yeah.
What's next for you, James? I know you're completing a manuscript now for the University of Mississippi.
Yes. Well, hopefully Major Figures will find its final resting place in the first quarter of 2012, pushing to make that happen. I'm finishing up a collection of essays called In Media Res, which is based on a conference that I did back at Bucknell a couple of years back, and that hopefully will go into production this year. And then I'm gonna, continue to do my work on cable news, and I'm trying to, as you can already see, write a little bit more publicly this year, and hopefully folk will have lots of opportunities and lots of platforms to hear what I think and see my commentary on particular issues.
Real quick, we had Eddie Glaude on recently. Eddie, of course, who's the director of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton. We talked a little bit about, the challenge and faces Black studies. What's it been like for you these first 6 months directing a Black Studies department at a small Northeast liberal arts school? Have there been any surprises for you thus far?
Well, I mean, it is a tremendous amount of work, and not that I need the thanks, but it's somewhat of a thankless job. I think for me, I'm still so excited about it and so excited about the opportunity to realize my vision. I don't know if folk know this, but I have 3 hires over the next couple of years, and I have a rotating pre-doc, postdoc. So I have an opportunity to
build something,
to build something and bring young scholars in. So I'm still extremely excited. And again, the media stuff serves me here because I'm trying to put that little Northeast Africana Studies program on the map.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor James Braxton Peterson, Director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University, where he's also an Associate Professor of English. Thanks for coming through today, James.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Take care.
Take care, bro.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.